It was one of the strangest medical events in human history, a time when hundreds of people lost control of their own bodies and could not stop moving. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg became the center of a phenomenon that no one could explain. There was no music or celebration, no festival or reason for joy, yet the streets filled with people who danced without rest, collapsed from exhaustion, and stood up again to continue. Physicians described it as an illness, the church called it a punishment from heaven, but everyone agreed on one thing: the city was trapped in a dance that would not end. It began with a woman named Frau Trophia. In late July, she stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to move uncontrollably. Her husband tried to calm her, neighbors gathered to watch, but the movements continued through the night. She showed no sign of awareness, no reaction to voices, and no exhaustion strong enough to stop her. For 3 days she danced without pause, her feet bleeding and her body shaking from fatigue. When she collapsed, she rested only moments before rising again. Word spread quickly, and curiosity turned into alarm. Within a week, several citizens joined her. They claimed they could not resist the impulse to move. Their faces were pale, their breathing irregular, yet their arms and legs kept rhythm as if controlled by another force. Small groups appeared across the city, moving without music and without coordination. Attempts to restrain them failed. Some families tied their relatives to beds or benches, but once released, the convulsions began again. By the end of the month, dozens were affected, turning the quiet streets of Strasbourg into open spaces of exhaustion and confusion. The city council summoned both physicians and clergy to explain what was happening. The priests called it divine punishment and ordered public prayers to Saint Vitus, believed to protect against such fits. The doctors disagreed. According to the theory of humors, the blood of the afflicted had overheated and needed to be released through continued movement. They advised that dancing should not be stopped but carefully supervised until the body cooled. The council accepted this view and provided food, water, and shelter for the dancers so they would not die of thirst. To maintain order, musicians were hired to play drums and flutes, keeping a steady tempo. The measure was meant to control the movements, but it had the opposite effect. The sound spread through the streets, attracting spectators who soon began to move themselves. The dancing now covered several districts, and witnesses described people collapsing from exhaustion only to rise again moments later. Some shouted prayers, others laughed or cried, and many remained silent while their bodies moved without rest. Doctors watched but refused to intervene, convinced the cure was still in progress. By early August, the numbers exceeded 100. Markets closed, trade slowed, and the streets filled with onlookers and the afflicted. Officials recorded that even silence no longer stopped the motion. Those who avoided the sound of music still found themselves trembling. The clergy continued to hold masses, the physicians continued to observe, and the council waited for the illness to pass. But each day brought new cases, and the city began to realize that what had started with one woman was no longer a medical curiosity but a crisis. Strasbourg was now a city in motion, and no one knew how to make it stop. By the first week of August 1518, the situation in Strasbourg had grown out of control. What had begun with one woman's strange movements now involved dozens of citizens who could not stop dancing. They filled the narrow streets from morning until night, moving with a force that seemed to ignore exhaustion. Witnesses said the dancers looked awake but empty, their faces fixed and their eyes unfocused. Families tried to restrain them, but ropes broke and arms slipped free. The bodies moved as if directed by something stronger than will. The air was filled with the sound of feet striking the stones, a constant rhythmic pounding that spread through the neighborhoods. Those who tried to rest began to tremble again, rising from the ground and returning to motion as if compelled. The council gathered in confusion. The city's priests announced that the plague was punishment for sin, and ordered prayers and processions to appease heaven. Citizens marched through the streets with relics and candles, calling on Saint Vitus to protect them from what they believed was divine wrath. The clergy urged the people to fast, confess, and repent, but nothing changed. When the priests failed, physicians were summoned. They rejected the idea of possession and claimed the cause was physical, that the blood of the afflicted had overheated from the summer heat and needed release through movement. The treatment they prescribed was simple: let the dancers continue until the fever burned itself out. Following that advice, the council built wooden platforms in the city center and cleared public squares where the dancers could move freely. To prevent chaos, they hired musicians and drummers to guide the rhythm, believing that controlled music might calm the afflicted. But the plan only worsened the crisis. The sound of drums echoed through the streets and drew more people in. Onlookers who came to watch began to shake and join, unable to stop themselves once the rhythm reached them. The movement spread rapidly through the population. The idea that music could heal now looked like madness. The council's own measures had turned the epidemic into a public spectacle. Within days the numbers had grown to hundreds. Witnesses described men and women collapsing, rising again, and continuing until their feet bled through their shoes. Some screamed for help, others laughed uncontrollably, and many moved in silence, their mouths dry from thirst. Families carried their relatives indoors, but even inside the convulsions continued. The hospitals overflowed, and physicians recorded the deaths of those whose hearts had stopped from exhaustion. Theories multiplied: poison air, bad grain, demonic influence, yet no one could explain how so many people could lose control in the same way. By mid-August the council began to reconsider the medical advice. The organized dancing areas were dismantled, and musicians were dismissed. Guards were posted to keep order, and prayers resumed in every church. But the damage was done. The sound of movement had already spread through the entire city. The council's records show that commerce had stopped, markets were closed, and travel suspended. What had begun as a local event had now become a citywide crisis. The officials who once spoke of overheated blood now spoke only of fear. Strasbourg, once a center of trade and learning, had turned into a place where no one slept and the streets never stood still. By the final week of August 1518, Strasbourg was no longer a functioning city. What had started as a strange curiosity now dominated daily life. More than 400 people were still moving day and night, their bodies shaking and bending in a rhythm that no one could stop. The council's earlier attempts to manage the situation had failed completely. The wooden stages built for the dancers had turned into open-air hospitals filled with collapsing figures, and the music meant to organize the movements had only increased their intensity. The sound of drums and feet had become unbearable. Merchants abandoned their shops, craftsmen left their workshops, and travelers avoided the city entirely. The streets of Strasbourg, once filled with markets and sermons, were now places of exhaustion and death. The authorities gathered in emergency sessions almost daily. Reports from every district confirmed that people were dying not from infection but from exhaustion. Hearts simply stopped after days of movement without rest. Physicians still defended their theory of overheated blood, claiming that only the body's own energy could burn out the illness, but the evidence of failure was everywhere. The council finally ordered that music be banned, public dancing forbidden, and musicians punished if they played. Drums, flutes, and pipes were confiscated and locked away. Silence was now the city's medicine. The clergy took control next. Priests declared the outbreak a form of divine punishment, a visible sign of sin and indulgence that had provoked the anger of heaven. Processions were banned, taverns were closed, gambling outlawed, and citizens ordered to fast and confess. Groups of monks walked through the streets carrying relics of Saint Vitus and sprinkling holy water on the ground where the dancers had fallen. But the movement continued. The afflicted did not respond to prayer or to command. Many seemed unaware of what was happening around them, eyes open but unfocused, mouths muttering or silent. It became clear that no authority, religious or medical, could explain what had taken control of their bodies. In a final attempt to contain the epidemic, the city organized the transport of the remaining dancers to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne, a small town north of Strasbourg. Carried on wagons and supported by monks, the exhausted victims were led barefoot into the chapel. There they were given small wooden crosses, sprinkled with holy water, and made to wear red shoes blessed by the priests. Chroniclers wrote that some stopped moving at the altar, collapsing into deep sleep as if released from their torment. Others continued to tremble until they fainted. The rituals offered some relief but no clear explanation. By early September the crisis began to fade. The number of new cases declined sharply, and those who survived could barely walk. Their muscles were torn, their feet infected, and their minds confused. Many died within days from weakness and dehydration. The council ordered the streets to be cleaned and the stages dismantled, hoping to erase all trace of the madness. Public music remained banned for months, and citizens avoided festivals or dancing for fear the curse might return. When life finally resumed, Strasbourg was changed. The event had lasted only a few weeks, but it left the population deeply scarred. No one understood what had caused it, whether poison, hysteria, or something beyond reason. In the records of that year the city's officials described no cure, only silence, a silence that came after hundreds had moved themselves to death. For generations the story was retold as a warning, not about demons or disease, but about how easily the human mind and body can lose control together. The summer of 1518 became known as the time when Strasbourg danced itself to exhaustion and fear replaced understanding. When the last dancers fell silent, Strasbourg was left to face the question that no one could answer: why had it happened at all? The records from that summer gave no clear cause, only confusion and contradiction. Some said the plague was sent by God to punish the sins of the city. Others claimed it was the work of demons or spirits that possessed the weak. The physicians who survived the crisis continued to defend their theory of overheated blood, arguing that poor diet, humidity, and the stress of famine had disturbed the balance of the body. None of these explanations fully matched the facts, yet all were accepted because the alternative, that hundreds of people could lose control of their own movement without reason, seemed impossible to imagine. The council ordered an official inquiry, collecting witness accounts from the hospitals, churches, and surrounding villages. Testimonies described trembling limbs, rigid faces, and voices that prayed while the bodies danced. Several survivors reported that they had no memory of what they had done. They remembered pain in their legs and a heavy pressure in the chest, but nothing else. Others said they felt a constant fear that forced them to move, as if stillness would bring death. The physicians wrote that these symptoms were unlike any known illness. The church continued to link it to moral corruption, declaring that those affected had lived in excess or neglected their duties. For months sermons warned that the city had been given a lesson in obedience. Beyond Strasbourg, the story spread across Europe. Scholars debated whether it was mass possession, poisoning, or hysteria. Some linked it to ergot, a fungus found in spoiled rye that could cause hallucinations and spasms when consumed in bread. Others believed it was a psychological outbreak triggered by hunger and disease after a series of harsh winters. Strasbourg had suffered famine, political unrest, and repeated outbreaks of plague in the years before 1518, leaving the population anxious and weakened. The dancing, according to this theory, was a collective reaction, a physical expression of fear and despair. It spread because everyone shared the same tension, and once released, it moved through the crowd like fire through dry grass. The idea of a collective illness was difficult for 16th-century minds to accept. The people of Strasbourg lived in a world where the boundary between the spiritual and the physical was thin. Sickness could be a symptom of sin as easily as of infection. Even after the movement ended, priests continued to hold weekly prayers to Saint Vitus to prevent its return. The council banned public dancing, limited festivals, and prohibited loud music in the squares. For a time the city lived in quiet caution, avoiding anything that might awaken the memory of that summer. Modern historians still debate what the citizens of Strasbourg experienced. No disease has ever repeated the event in the same form or scale. The written records show exhaustion, dehydration, heart failure, and social collapse, but they reveal nothing about what caused so many people to lose control at once. It remains one of the most documented yet least understood epidemics of the Middle Ages. The explanations have changed with time, but the mystery has not. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as a symbol of how fragile order can be when fear and faith collide. In a single season, an entire city obeyed a rhythm no one could hear, a movement that came from nowhere and ended without reason. Strasbourg recovered, but its name remained forever linked to the summer when hundreds of ordinary people danced themselves to death, a reminder that even reason and belief together could not explain the power of the human mind under pressure. When the epidemic finally ended in the early days of September 1518, Strasbourg was silent for the first time in weeks. The platforms had been dismantled, the musicians dismissed, and the streets cleared of bodies. Those who survived were left unable to walk, their feet infected and their joints swollen beyond repair. Many died shortly after from exhaustion or complications that no one could treat. The city's hospitals were filled with the weak and the delirious, and families buried their relatives quietly, without ceremony. There was no final announcement, no clear moment when it stopped. The movements simply faded, and the city was left to clean the ruins of what it could not understand. The council moved quickly to restore order. Markets reopened, trade resumed, and public gatherings were strictly regulated. Music was banned for months, dancing was declared illegal under threat of punishment. Sermons warned against temptation, taverns were inspected, and festivals were cancelled. The authorities feared that even the sound of rhythm might awaken what they called the sickness of motion. The city that had once celebrated parades and guild feasts now walked in deliberate silence. For the rest of that year, the bells of the cathedral were the only permitted sound in the streets. Despite these restrictions, rumors persisted. Some said the dancers were not cured but had been taken away and hidden by the church. Others believed the plague had moved to neighboring towns, though no records confirmed it. The people of Strasbourg preferred not to speak about it. Those who had witnessed the events avoided the squares where the platforms once stood. In private, families whispered about curses, spirits, and divine anger, but in public, silence became the rule. The city's leaders avoided mentioning the incident in correspondence, embarrassed by their failure to control it. Over the following decades, smaller outbreaks appeared in other regions of the Rhine Valley, in towns like Cologne and Basel, but none reached the same scale. The Strasbourg event became the reference point, cited in medical texts and sermons alike. Physicians used it to argue for balance in diet and temperature, while priests used it to warn against moral decay. In both interpretations, the human body remained the center of the mystery, a vessel that could be overtaken by forces neither physical nor spiritual explanations could fully define. In the centuries that followed, scholars tried to reinterpret the event through the lens of psychology and social stress. Some saw it as mass hysteria, the result of trauma caused by famine, disease, and religious fear. Others blamed contaminated grain or ergot poisoning, though evidence was limited. Whatever the cause, the event revealed how quickly stability could collapse in a society balanced between faith and uncertainty. The people of Strasbourg were not ignorant, they were desperate, living in an age where hunger, plague, and war left few answers and even fewer hopes. Today the dancing plague is remembered not as a legend but as a recorded historical fact. Its documents survive in civic archives, church records, and letters written by witnesses who described the same sight, hundreds of citizens moving until their hearts failed. Historians still debate its nature, but no theory replaces the strangeness of the truth itself. For several weeks in 1518, a European city lost control of its own body. It stands as a reminder that the line between belief and biology, between panic and disease, is thin and fragile. The summer when Strasbourg danced remains one of the most haunting examples of how fear, faith, and the human mind can combine to create a catastrophe that reason alone cannot explain.